Welcome to the discussion. My guests today are Anthony Belfiore, the Senior Vice President and Chief Security Officer of Aon and a Tanium board member, and Ralph Kahn, the Vice President of Federal for Tanium. Anthony, Ralph, welcome to the discussion.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Thanks.
Let me set a little context for our discussion today. We've all heard over the last 9 months that the move to remote working has expanded the threat surface of agencies. And it's not just cybersecurity risk we're talking about. It's increased risks to data, to mission, to people. A new survey from the Association of Federal Enterprise Risk Management found 50% of the respondents said their ERM program has been, quote, extremely engaged or, quote, highly engaged in their organization's response to the pandemic. The survey found organizations with chief risk officers led ERM programs are almost twice as likely as others to be highly engaged or extremely engaged versus organizations with non-CRO led programs. Additionally, nearly 2/3, about 64% of respondents are anticipating implementing changes to their ERM programs, specifically in response to the pandemic. It seems like agencies are recognizing how their risk posture is changing and how they need to adjust their approach to ERM. Well, how can agencies do that? How can they adjust that approach? Well, that's where our guests come in. Let me again turn to our guests. Anthony Belfiore is the Senior Vice President and Chief Risk Officer at Aon and a Tanium board member, and Ralph Kahn is the Vice President of Federal at Tanium. They're going to give us some insights, some thoughts about current and future states of enterprise risk management across the government. Ralph, let me just start with you because Tanium deals with this idea of risk management with agencies every day. What is different? How are agencies thinking differently about risk management when it comes across their enterprise?
So I think you hit it on the head. Work from home and COVID has caused a tremendous change in the attack surface. People now are using devices they weren't using before. They're doing it from places and networks that they weren't doing it before. And a lot of the organizations are really having to rethink what that means in terms of their enterprise risk. And there are lots of different kinds of risk. Obviously, technology risk is one that's on the front pages a lot these days, particularly in light of SolarWinds. But there are the associated operational risks that go with that, the financial risks that go with that. And inside the government, there are national risks and security risks and things that commercial industry may not think about. So a lot of the executives of the government are weighing how do they effectively respond to COVID-19 and get their mission going again and balance that against a whole new set of risks that they really hadn't had a chance to spend a lot of time preparing for because nobody anticipated having to do it.
That balance is I think initially was tough. It has gotten easier, but as more agencies work from home, as the pandemic continues and forces us to really rethink our approach to mission, to services, how are agencies able to balance that risk? Does it get easier the longer we are in the pandemic remote working world? Does it get harder? What's your thoughts?
No, look, I think we've just had agencies, government agencies, private sector, the global economy. We've just had a nice 10-month business continuity exercise, right? A DR on the fly. Let's test all those disaster recovery capabilities. Let's test all that business continuity preparedness, the process, the people, the process, the technology, so that we can actually operate our business in this new paradigm, in this new remote paradigm. And what does that do from an operational risk perspective, an enterprise risk perspective? To Ralph's point, what are the implications financially, legally, contractually, from a regulatory perspective, from a secrecy and mission perspective for the gov, and depending on the agency we're talking about, how are these things impacted? And, I think the surprising thing at the end of this 10-month or 12-month cycle, depending when you started your discrete program at your discrete entity, guys like us found out that, we're pretty prepared. The technology works a hell of a lot better than we thought it was gonna. We found some great disruptive technology, some great ways to innovate in the way we did business, and we were able to retain that core business resilience. We were able to retain the continuity in our core business processes a hell of a lot better than most of us expected. Now, that said, that was offset by new threats, new risks that came out by being as a byproduct of being in that new operational model, i.e., more phishing attacks than we've ever seen in our life, because the bad actors out there, the nation states, the fraudsters, they know that we're in this compromised position. Our employees are not working in that nice central core of a government facility with all the controls and the oversight and the monitoring that you typically have. You've moved to a decentralized, you're coming in from your house. So they've tried, new spear phishing techniques and new attacks against our our employees, new social engineering scams, and we've seen a huge uptick in that space, and we've all had to address that. But generally, I would say COVID has been a pleasantly surprising outcome for 95% of the entities that have had to deal with this remotely. And that goes for gov, that goes for private sector. I've talked to guys in all different branches to all different businesses and industries. And everyone is saying the same thing. Wow, what WebEx did for us, what Zoom did for us, what, pick the Microsoft, the Google, everyone's got a product to play in this space. Like, it was really unbelievable the way this all came together.
Ralph, I really like something that Anthony said, which is this was a great test of business resilience, of continuity of operations. For years, agencies have talked about this. For years, Tanium and other companies have talked to companies about, hey, be prepared for the unknown. And this shows that agencies have done a pretty good job. Do you get that same sense when you talk to agencies? Are they, if you will, proud of how they've managed their risk?
So I think by and large, agencies are proud of their response to COVID, and it's a multifaceted thing. It's one thing to get the employees up and running from home. It's another to make sure those same employees are doing okay, right? It gets a little isolating at home. And there are a lot of factors that come into the risk equation here. But I think from a technology perspective, many of the agencies are proud of what they've accomplished. And they've pivoted very quickly from, as Anthony said, a centralized in the core network model to a totally decentralized. Everybody's at home coming in through VPNs. What security controls do we use? How do we make sure there's some amount of monitoring? And by and large, there are a lot of different ways the agencies got there, but they all got there. And so I think there is a lot to be proud of there.
Because one of the things that comes up as you talk about agencies making progress, and as Anthony said, about 95% of all entities were really pleasantly surprised about their outcomes, is this distinction between the different risks they do face. Again, we've talked about technology and cyber risk, but there's mission risk and business risk and financial risk. Talk a little bit about how they're related and how can agencies really think through all those pieces and parts.
I guess I'll take it, Ralph. Look, I think when you think about the ecosystem of risk, right? Everything that's out there and how we play it, I think there's different taxonomy, there's different terminology, there's different way people kind of wrap this up into kind of different assessment protocols, ontologies of how they assess and what they call things. Generally speaking, I think the two top terms you will hear generally are enterprise risk or operational risk, right? At scale, right? And all these other risks are kind of a subset: cyber, financial, regulatory, all the different contractual, all the different risks that factor into this. What I will tell you on the gov side, from what the conversations I've had with my peers who both support them as contractors, kind of guys who are in my role at some of the biggest contractors in the world that support the US Gov, to actual people in agencies and what they're dealing with right now, is that, historically, people get very mission focused. You kind of got blinders on, and you kind of take a lot for granted on the underlying infrastructure, the foundation of your operation. And in terms of the operational risk, that you're not really paying attention to a lot of these other risks that just, your supplier risk, right? Your financial, everyone's pretty cognizant of financial risk in the gov. We know our budgets, we know our cycles. People know kind of generally that there's a finite amount of time, finite amount of dollars, finite amount of cycles to get work done. And we got a mission to accomplish depending on where you are. So what's the best way to prioritize that from one to end and go after it? We're pretty good at that. But what ends up happening is when these ancillary risks that come in out of nowhere, whether it's a risk of just core business interruption because of the tech and the model you're operating, or the actual risk from regulatory exposure or national security exposures or whatever, because these are different things that are going to impact that kind of core day-to-day job. So when I was talking to these folks, the biggest surprise was the majority of them says taking the blinders off and seeing everything at scale and realizing that in order to support this new operating model, we have to start actually taking supplier risk seriously, right? They didn't actually think of the implications that, hey, historically, I just kind of focused, they came to me, everything was on-prem, we were in our operation, we were going to task. Oh, and by the way, now we just changed the whole paradigm, and I have to work in these guys' clouds or leverage these guys' technologies to facilitate us going forward. How do we manage that risk? How do I manage the risk of that third-party supplier? Do we even do oversight on them? Oh, and by the way, how do we know that they're not outsourcing our stuff to fourth and fifth party, and fourth and fifth party risk comes into the mix? So a lot of interesting things. I think the biggest thing that COVID has spawned is the fact that it's made a lot of people cognizant of a lot of other risk areas that they weren't typically dealing with in their day to day. I think it's forced us to look at a much broader view of operational and enterprise risk across our entities. And that's a wake-up call, because you know what? The business we're getting into, and guys like me who do security historically, physical and cyber and threat intelligence and all this great stuff, we're starting to realize the real end game is about operational resilience and not about cyber resilience. It's a much bigger play. And that operational resilience is really predicated on a number of other areas that need to be addressed from a risk perspective.
Anthony, I want to go back to something you said, because I think this is really important key piece here. The supplier risk that people maybe didn't think of. Well, when I called XYZ company, Tanium, they were there. Well, now Tanium's getting calls from 50 agencies and 70 CIOs, and everybody needs something today, not yesterday, not tomorrow, not when you can get it to me. I think that really has been a different kind of wake-up call. And I think that's why we're seeing is that why you think we're moving from just this quote unquote cyber resilience to operational resilience? Because this has been a little bit of a wake-up call about this broader issue. To get mission done, I need all these pieces to come into place, not just the technology piece.
Definitely, brother. I think it takes a village, so to speak, right? You know, it's an amalgamation of different services, different capability, both tech, both people, manual, you know, in a lot of cases to run these businesses. Although we did leverage technology to automate away some of our overhead, to make us innovate in new ways and interact in new disruptive ways, there was still a lot of flex up in people and resources and services as well. So it's an amalgamation of skills. It's an amalgamation of, again, very cliche, people, process, and technology being utilized in ways we hadn't used it before, and understanding kind of, now that we're using things in this way, what do the new risk profiles look like? What are the impacts of operating in a remote, decentralized model, doing some of the same mission critical work we were doing before in, let's say, not as secure environments, not as resilient environments, and with other factors that you never thought about having to worry about. You know, some of these suppliers historically were never supposed to have this level of access or this level of data, but we've been forced into a mode where we have to leverage them. And so how do we start thinking about doing that risk assessment, doing that risk quantification and qualification, and understanding from an enterprise risk perspective how we go about addressing it in the most effective manner?
Those are great points. And I think that as agencies are thinking about this, as industry is thinking about this, because the risk piece falls onto them as much as it falls onto each individual agency, that they're going to start have that change of thought process, the operational resiliency piece. Let's take a quick break. When we come back, we can continue our conversation. You're listening to the discussion, Strengthening Technology Risk Management in the Federal Government, sponsored by Tanium on Federal News Network.